An Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran once threw himself into speeding traffic to save a little boy he had never met. Moments later, instead of being thanked, he was surrounded by police as a PTSD flashback made the town believe he had become dangerous. Everyone thought they knew who Ethan Walker was, until a forgotten military photograph, a buried battlefield secret, and a truth hidden for 12 years began to reveal that the man they feared had sacrificed everything to save others, both in war and long after it ended. Rain had a way of making Cody, Wyoming feel even quieter than usual. By early evening, Main Street glistened beneath rows of amber streetlights, their reflections stretching across wet pavement like fading memories. Pickup trucks rolled slowly through town, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the cold October rain. Steam drifted from the chimney of Miller's roadside diner, where locals gathered for hot coffee, homemade meatloaf, and conversations that rarely changed from one week to the next. Outside, standing beneath a faded neon sign, Ethan Walker adjusted the collar of his worn canvas jacket before stepping toward the entrance. Most people barely noticed him anymore. Those who did usually looked away. At 39, Ethan carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had once worn a uniform every day. His dark hair had begun to gray around the temples, and deep lines framed eyes that always seemed to be searching somewhere beyond the present. A weathered baseball cap shaded part of his face, while old work boots splashed through shallow puddles as he crossed the parking lot. He had served 2 deployments in Iraq and another in Afghanistan before returning home nearly 8 years earlier. Since then, life had become something he survived rather than lived. He worked maintenance at Liberty Oaks, an aging apartment complex supported by the Department of Veterans Affairs, spending his days repairing broken heaters, leaking pipes, squeaky doors, and worn electrical wiring for veterans who had nowhere else to go. The work was honest, even if it barely paid enough to keep gas in his truck and food in his refrigerator. People in town simply called him that veteran. Some remembered his service. Most remembered the stories. The stories were easier. They whispered that he kept to himself, that loud noises made him jump, that he sometimes froze when fireworks exploded on Independence Day, that he avoided crowds, that he wasn't quite right anymore. None of them knew why. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee and grilled onions wrapped around him like an old blanket. Waitress Linda Morris smiled gently. "Evening, Ethan." "Evening, Linda. The usual?" He nodded. She didn't ask questions anymore. She knew enough to leave silence where silence belonged. Ethan sat near the window, nursing a cup of black coffee while rain rolled down the glass in uneven streams. Across the room, families laughed over dinner. Truck drivers compared weather forecasts. A young couple argued softly over wedding plans. Ordinary life. The kind he sometimes wondered if he still belonged to. He reached unconsciously toward the faded chain around his neck hidden beneath his shirt. A military dog tag. The second one. The first rested beneath white marble thousands of miles away. A sharp burst of laughter erupted behind him. For one impossible second, it sounded exactly like Corporal Mason Brooks laughing inside a dusty convoy outside Kandahar. Ethan closed his eyes. Not now. Not here. He focused on his breathing. 1, 2, 3. The sound faded. Linda quietly set a slice of apple pie beside his coffee. "You didn't order that. You always look like you need it." He managed the smallest smile. "Thanks." Before he could take a bite, the diner door swung open. Cold wind rushed inside. A young woman hurried through carrying grocery bags while trying to answer her ringing phone. Beside her skipped a little boy wearing a bright blue raincoat, no older than 5. "Stay close, Owen," she called without looking. "I know." He didn't. The automatic door closed. Outside, a truck blasted its horn. Ethan looked up instinctively. The little boy had wandered into the parking lot, then farther, toward the highway. Everything happened at once. A gust of wind tore the child's tiny dinosaur umbrella from his hands. The boy chased it, laughing, straight into the road. Headlights appeared around the curve. Too close. Someone screamed. The driver slammed on the brakes. Tires shrieked against soaked pavement. Without thinking, Ethan was already moving. His chair crashed backward. Coffee spilled across the floor. He sprinted through the rain faster than he thought his aching knees still could. "Owen!" The child's mother dropped her grocery bags. The little boy froze in the middle of the road, terrified by the blinding lights racing toward him. Ethan reached him a heartbeat before the truck. He wrapped one arm around the child and threw both of them toward the muddy shoulder. The pickup roared past, missing them by only a few feet. For a long second, silence. Rain continued falling. The little boy began crying. "It's okay," Ethan whispered, still holding him. "You're safe." The mother stumbled across the road, sobbing uncontrollably as she wrapped her son in her arms. "Oh my God, thank you, thank you." Ethan slowly stood. His breathing had changed. Too fast, too shallow. The truck horn, the wet pavement, the screaming. Something inside his mind unlocked. Another road, another country, another storm. Smoke, dust, gunfire. "Walker! Move! Incoming!" His hands started shaking violently. He wasn't in Wyoming anymore. He was back in Afghanistan. The smell of diesel mixed with wet earth. His heartbeat thundered inside his ears. He turned suddenly, scanning rooftops that no longer existed. People stepped backward. Someone whispered, "What's wrong with him?" A teenage boy pulled out his phone. "He's freaking out." Another voice, "I think he's dangerous." Ethan tried to answer. His words disappeared. He dropped to one knee, covering his ears. "Sergeant!" The voice echoed inside his head. "Mason's hit!" "No, not again. Not again." "Sir?" A hand reached toward him. Ethan instinctively jerked away. The movement looked far worse than it was. Within minutes, flashing blue lights illuminated the rain. Two Cody police officers hurried across the parking lot. One spoke calmly. "Sir, can you look at me?" Ethan tried. He really tried. But all he saw were flashing emergency lights cutting through Afghan dust. The younger officer reached for his shoulder. Ethan flinched hard. The officer instinctively stepped back. "Easy." Another bystander muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "See? Told you. Guy's unstable." He snapped. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Neither appeared hostile, only cautious. After several tense minutes, Ethan finally forced himself to breathe. In, out, again. The panic slowly released its grip. His vision cleared. The highway returned. Rain. Police. Concerned faces. No battlefield. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. I lost where I was." The older officer nodded gently. "Do you have someone we can call?" Ethan shook his head. "No." An ambulance crew examined him briefly before confirming he wasn't physically injured. The officers chose not to arrest him. Still, protocol required them to escort him to the station long enough to complete reports and verify what had happened. By the time Ethan was released an hour later, most of Cody already had its own version of the story. The veteran had another episode. The veteran scared everyone. The veteran almost attacked police. Truth traveled slowly. Rumors drove pickup trucks. Across town, inside a black SUV parked quietly beneath a cottonwood tree, an elderly man removed his reading glasses. Beside him sat a distinguished woman in her late 60s, her silver hair neatly tied back. Her grandson slept peacefully beneath a blanket in the rear seat. "He saved Owen's life," she said softly. "Yes. And then everyone judged him." The older man watched Ethan's lonely figure walk through the rain toward his rusted pickup. "He never asked who we were. No, he only saw a child." The woman looked toward the courthouse rising above the town square. "We need to know who that man really is." The older gentleman nodded once. "So do I." Neither revealed that he was Senior Federal Judge Harold Whitmore. Neither introduced themselves. Neither spoke to Ethan. Not yet. Late that night, Ethan unlocked the door to his modest rented house on the edge of town. The place was small, one bedroom. A faded American flag hung carefully folded inside a shadow box above the fireplace, beside photographs of soldiers whose smiles had never grown old. He removed his soaked boots, his jacket, his dog tags, then sat alone in the darkness.
The silence felt heavier than the rain.
He wondered, as he often did, whether coming home had somehow been harder than going to war. Outside, the storm finally began to pass. Morning arrived beneath clear Wyoming skies. The world looked washed clean. Ethan stepped outside carrying a mug of coffee before heading to work. Something rested inside his weathered mailbox. A plain manila envelope. No stamp. No return address. He frowned. Inside was an old military photograph. 8 young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder beside a dusty armored vehicle somewhere in Afghanistan. He recognized every face, every name. Every man, except himself, was gone. His fingers trembled. He slowly turned the photograph over. Written neatly in black ink were only 6 words. "The truth is finally coming." Ethan stared at the sentence as a cold breeze swept across the empty street. Someone remembered. Someone had never stopped searching. And for the first time in years, the past no longer felt buried. It felt like it was walking toward him. Ethan remained standing beside the mailbox long after the morning breeze had settled. The old photograph rested carefully between his fingers, its edges softened by time, its faces forever frozen beneath a desert sun. 8 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a battered armored vehicle somewhere in Afghanistan. They were young enough to believe they would all make it home. Only one of them had. He traced each face with his thumb. Corporal Mason Brooks, Sergeant First Class Daniel Ruiz, Specialist Aaron Cole, Private First Class Tyler Benson. Names that had not been spoken aloud in years, courtyard into his memory more deeply than any monument ever could. The words on the back of the photograph echoed inside his mind. The truth is finally coming. Who would send something like this? More importantly, why now? A sharp gust folded the American flag hanging from his porch. Ethan slipped the photograph back into the envelope and climbed into his aging Ford pickup. The engine hesitated before coughing to life, just as it had every morning for the past 6 years. He drove toward Liberty Oaks. The small housing complex sat on the eastern edge of Cody, surrounded by cottonwood trees already turning gold beneath the Wyoming autumn. It wasn't much to look at. 2 weathered brick buildings, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks. But to dozens of aging veterans, it was the closest thing they still had to home. Most residents greeted Ethan before sunrise, not because he was maintenance, because he listened. "Morning, Sarge." The voice belonged to Walter Jennings, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran struggling to maneuver his wheelchair across uneven concrete. "You've got that loose ramp fixed yet?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I'll have it done before lunch." You always say that, and I always do it. Walter laughed. Fair enough.
Inside Building A, the hallway smelled faintly of old coffee and furniture polish. Family photographs decorated apartment doors. Small American flags stood beside framed discharge certificates. Somewhere down the hall, Johnny Cash drifted softly from an old radio. Mrs. Evelyn Harris waved from apartment 12. My heater's making that awful knocking sound again. I'll stop by after lunch. You've already worked all weekend. I know. You need rest. Ethan shrugged. It'll still be broken tomorrow. She smiled knowingly. So will you. He didn't answer. Some truths required no response. By mid-morning, he had repaired 2 leaking faucets, replaced a faulty smoke detector, patched drywall inside a veteran's bathroom, and finally crawled beneath the wheelchair ramp with a socket wrench and fresh bolts. His hands moved with practiced confidence. Machines made sense. Metal either fit or it didn't. People were harder. Around noon, Liberty Oaks director Linda Chavez stepped outside carrying paperwork. You haven't taken a break. I'm okay. You always say that, too. She handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Turkey. You remembered? I remember everything. She hesitated. You've heard what's happening? Ethan looked up. No. Linda sighed. A company from Denver has offered to buy the property. His wrench stopped turning. They can't. They can try. They'll move everyone. They're calling it redevelopment. He stared across the courtyard where several elderly veterans sat playing checkers beneath a fading maple tree. Walter, Mrs. Harris, Mr. Duncan, who still woke screaming from Vietnam some nights. There was nowhere else for many of them to go. Who's buying it? Crosswell Development? The name meant nothing to Ethan. It isn't official, Linda continued, but they think this land is worth more than the people living on it. He tightened the final bolt until the wrench clicked. The ramp's fixed. Linda looked at him carefully. You always worry about everyone else. Their family. She nodded. I know. That afternoon, Ethan visited the VA medical center on the other side of town. Not because he wanted to, because every Thursday he kept the same appointment. Dr. Rebecca Lawson had treated veterans for nearly 20 years. Her office overlooked the Bighorn Mountains, where fresh snow dusted the highest peaks. She poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting down. You had another episode? He nodded. The diner. I read the police report. It wasn't exactly wrong. No, she said gently. But it wasn't complete either. He remained silent. She waited. Eventually, he spoke. I heard Mason. The same as before? Exactly the same. She wrote nothing down. She simply listened. I could smell diesel fuel. He rubbed his palms together. I knew I was standing in Wyoming. But part of you believed you were back there. Yes. Dr. Lawson leaned forward. PTSD doesn't mean you're weak, Ethan. I know. Then why do you keep apologizing for surviving? The room fell quiet. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead. Its distant blade sent a familiar vibration through the windows. Ethan's breathing changed almost immediately. Not panic. Recognition. Dr. Lawson noticed. You still blame yourself. I gave an order. You tried to save your men. I should have gotten them home. You brought back everyone you could. Not enough. He stared toward the mountains. It'll never be enough. After the appointment, Ethan stopped at Cody National Cemetery before heading home. Room of white headstones stretched across the hillside beneath an endless Wyoming sky. He often came here when the memories became too loud. Not because his platoon rested there. They didn't. But every cemetery felt familiar. Every folded flag, every marble marker, every grieving family. He placed a small American flag beside the grave of a local Marine whose parents had long since moved away. No one else had visited in weeks. "You shouldn't be forgotten," Ethan whispered. As he turned to leave, he noticed someone watching from several rows away. An older woman. Gray coat.
Dark sunglasses.
She stood beside another grave holding fresh white lilies. For a brief moment their eyes met. She offered a faint nod, then quietly walked away before Ethan could speak. He didn't know she had recognized him instantly. She hadn't forgotten his face, not after all these years. Back in town, Crosswell Development had already begun circulating glossy brochures promising luxury condominiums, boutique shops, and new economic opportunity. One slogan caught Ethan's attention: revitalizing Cody's future. He looked toward Liberty Oaks across the street. Whose future? That evening, he returned to the housing complex after finishing repairs elsewhere. Walter sat outside wrapped in a heavy army blanket. "You know," the old veteran said, "they'll tell us we're in the way." Ethan sat beside him. "They won't. They already have." Walter smiled sadly. "War teaches you something." "What's that?" "The people who remember your sacrifice usually aren't the ones making decisions." They watched the sun disappear behind distant mountains. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "Whatever happens," he looked directly at Ethan, "you never stop serving." The words lingered long after darkness settled across Liberty Oaks. That night, sleep refused to come. Rain tapped softly against Ethan's bedroom window. He lay awake until nearly 2 a.m. before finally drifting into uneasy dreams. He was back in Afghanistan. Dust filled the air. An armored convoy burned beside a narrow mountain road. Gunfire echoed through the valley. Someone screamed his name. "Walker!" He turned. Mason lay bleeding behind shattered concrete. "Leave me! I'm not leaving anyone!" The radio crackled. "Immediate evacuation." Another voice. "Mission priority." Ethan ignored it. He dragged one wounded soldier, then another, then another. The helicopter never waited. The explosion came before sunrise. He woke violently, breathing hard, sheets soaked with sweat. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m.
The same time. Every anniversary. Every year. Unable to sleep again, Ethan grabbed his coat and drove through the quiet streets. Downtown, Cody slept beneath pale moonlight. Near the abandoned train station on the edge of town, he noticed movement beneath the broken platform. Someone was there. An elderly man sat wrapped in a thin blanket, shivering uncontrollably beside a shopping cart. The temperature had already dropped below freezing. Without hesitation, Ethan parked. "You okay?" The old man looked up slowly. His beard was white. His army field jacket was nearly worn through. "Didn't think anybody still asked that." Ethan removed his own heavy coat and wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders. "You served?" The old man nodded once. "Vietnam." "You eaten today?" A faint shake of the head. "Come on. I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity." Ethan offered his hand. "It's one soldier helping another." Hidden across the street, beneath the dim glow of a newspaper office window, a woman lowered the camera she'd been using to photograph the abandoned station for a redevelopment story. Instead, she focused her lens on the quiet scene unfolding beneath the platform. She captured one frame. A forgotten veteran giving away his own coat to save another forgotten veteran from the cold. She had no idea that the man in the photograph was already carrying a secret that could shake the Department of Defense. She only knew she had witnessed something the town needed to see. And somewhere, tucked safely inside Ethan's kitchen drawer, an old military photograph waited silently for the next piece of the truth to reveal itself. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. A thin layer of frost covered the sidewalks outside Liberty Oaks, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight. Ethan unlocked the maintenance shed before anyone else had arrived,
just as he did every weekday. Routine was more than habit now. It was the only thing that kept the noise in his mind organized. He filled his worn thermos with coffee, checked the repair requests clipped to a weathered clipboard, and quietly began another day. Apartment 14. Replace bathroom faucet. Apartment 21. Repair broken wheelchair brake. Apartment 7. Reset heating controls. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic. Just people who depended on him. Walter Jennings rolled into the courtyard wrapped in his army blanket. "You beat the sun again." Ethan smiled. "The pipes don't fix themselves." Walter studied him for a moment. "You look tired. Didn't sleep much. You never do." The old veteran reached into his jacket pocket and handed Ethan a small pocket knife. Its wooden handle was scratched smooth from decades of use. "My father carried that in Korea. I can't take this. You aren't taking it." Walter closed Ethan's hand around it. "I'm lending it." "What for?" "So you'll remember somebody believes in you." Ethan swallowed quietly. "Thank you." Before he could say anything else, a white pickup carrying the Crosswell Development logo pulled into the parking lot. Two sharply dressed men stepped out. One carried a clipboard. The other wore an expensive overcoat despite the mild morning. Linda Chavez walked outside immediately. "Gentlemen, we're here to inspect the property." "You don't own it." "Not yet." The taller man smiled politely. "But we're optimistic." They walked through the complex making notes. Cracked sidewalks, aging brickwork, old plumbing. They never once looked at the people sitting on the benches. To them, Liberty Oaks was real estate, not home. Ethan continued repairing the wheelchair brake inside apartment 21. Mr. Howard Mills watched him tighten the final bolt. "My daughter wants me to move. You don't?" Howard looked around the tiny apartment. Photographs of his Navy service hung beside pictures of grandchildren. "I've buried too many friends already." He smiled sadly. "I don't want to bury another life." Ethan understood. Sometimes home wasn't about the building. Sometimes it was about who still remembered your name. By lunchtime, the entire town seemed to be talking about the newspaper. Stacks disappeared quickly from the rack outside Miller's roadside diner. Across the front page stretched a large photograph. An elderly homeless veteran wrapped inside a familiar brown canvas coat. Beside him stood Ethan. The headline read, "Local Veteran Spends Night Helping Homeless Man." The article itself, however, told only part of the story. It mentioned Ethan had previously been involved in a police incident outside the diner. It questioned whether his behavior reflected untreated trauma. It praised his compassion while subtly reminding readers of his instability. The words weren't entirely false. They simply left too much unsaid. Inside the diner, conversations began before coffee reached the tables. "I told you he's unpredictable." "Maybe. But he did help that old fellow." "Doesn't mean I'd want him watching my kids." Rumors always found a way to survive longer than facts. Linda Morris folded the paper with a sigh. They almost got it right. A customer looked up. "What do you mean?" "They forgot the important part." "And what's that?" "He never asks who deserves help." Across town, the woman behind the article stared at the published edition with visible frustration. Her name was Sarah Collins. She had submitted nearly twice as much material. The editor had shortened it. The photographs of Ethan quietly buying breakfast for the homeless veteran. Gone. The interview with emergency responders praising Ethan's calm after recovering from the PTSD episode. Gone. The comments from witnesses who saw him save the little boy. Reduced to one sentence. She leaned back in her chair. That's not the story. Her editor shrugged. It sells papers. It buries people. It raises questions. It creates the wrong ones. Without another word, Sarah collected her notebook and walked out. She wasn't finished. Not even close. That afternoon, Ethan visited the VA hospital after work. Not for therapy, for volunteers hour.
Every Thursday, he repaired broken walkers, adjusted wheelchairs, and replaced batteries in hearing aids that many patients couldn't afford to fix. Nurse Angela Foster smiled as he entered the workshop. "You're off the clock." "I know. You could go home." He lifted a wheelchair onto the repair stand. "This is home for some of them." An elderly Marine watched quietly from the corner. "My daughter keeps asking why you don't charge." Ethan shrugged. "I've got tools." "You've also got bills." "So do they." The Marine laughed softly. "Your generation never learned how to quit serving." Ethan didn't answer. Maybe because the Marine was right, or maybe because he no longer knew how to separate service from living. Late that evening, Sarah Collins parked outside Liberty Oaks. She watched Ethan loading scrap lumber into the back of his truck. He looked exactly like every ordinary working man she'd ever photographed. No entourage,
No recognition. No complaints. She approached carefully.
"Mr. Walker?"
He turned.
"I'm Sarah Collins."
"I know."
"You read the paper?"
"I did."
"I'm sorry."
He looked confused.
"You didn't write that headline."
"No."
"They changed your story."
"They changed yours, too." He smiled faintly. "That happens." She hesitated.
"I'd like to interview you."
"I don't have anything interesting to say."
"I think you do."
He shook his head. "I'm just maintenance."
People don't volunteer hundreds of hours because they're just maintenance.
They do if someone needs help. She noticed the old military pocket knife clipped to his belt.
"Were you always like this?"
"No."
"What changed?"
He looked toward the fading sunset. "The men who never came home." Silence settled between them. Sarah realized she had just heard the most honest sentence Ethan would probably offer anyone.
"I won't push."
"Thank you. But I am going to ask one question." He nodded.
"What happened in Afghanistan?"
For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan's expression changed completely. Not anger, not fear. Grief. A grief so old it had become part of who he was.
"I lost good men."
Sarah waited. "I should have brought them home." She wanted to ask more. She didn't. Instead, she simply thanked him and left. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had spent years making sure the public never heard the whole story. The following Monday, trouble arrived at Liberty Oaks. Crosswell Development held a public meeting inside the town community center. Residents packed every folding chair. Veterans filled the back rows. Families lined the walls. A polished presentation filled the large projection screen. Luxury housing, retail space, economic growth. Smiling models walking through buildings that didn't yet exist. Not once did the presentation mention where the veterans would go. One elderly resident finally stood. "Where are we supposed to live?" The developer adjusted his tie. "Alternative accommodations will be discussed." "When?" "At the appropriate time." "What time is that?" "When the transition begins." The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Veterans who had spent decades following orders now demanded simple answers. None came. Linda Chavez stepped forward. "These people served this country," the developer answered smoothly, "and we thank them for their service." Walter Jennings rose slowly from his wheelchair. "We're tired of being thanked." The room fell silent. "We'd rather be remembered." Even the developer seemed momentarily uncomfortable. Outside the meeting hall, Ethan helped calm several anxious residents before walking quietly toward his truck. He never noticed Judge Harold Whitmore standing across the street. The judge had attended without introducing himself. He had listened, watched, observed. Most of all, he had watched Ethan. Not once had the former soldier argued for himself. Every word he spoke had been about protecting everyone else. Judge Whitmore opened a thick folder resting on the passenger seat of his sedan. Across the tab, someone had written in black marker, "Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker,
Classified personnel file. His eyes stopped on one page. Several paragraphs remained heavily redacted. One line, however, had survived. Recommendation for Distinguished Service Cross. Status: suspended pending classified operational review. The judge frowned. Military decorations were not suspended without extraordinary circumstances. Someone had hidden something. Back at home that evening, Ethan unlocked the kitchen drawer. The old photograph was exactly where he'd left it. He studied the faces once more. Then something caught his attention. There, barely visible in the lower corner, a handwritten number. 47. He frowned. He had never noticed it before. Not because it wasn't there, because he'd never looked closely enough. 47. A page? A unit? An evidence file? A military operation? Before he could think further, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. He answered cautiously.
"This is Ethan," a calm voice replied.
"Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker?" "Yes." "My name is Colonel David Mercer." There was a brief pause. "I'm calling on behalf of the Department of Defense." Ethan's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Years of military discipline returned instantly. "How can I help you, Colonel?" "We need to speak with you regarding an operational review connected to your service in Afghanistan." The room became perfectly still. His eyes drifted back to the photograph, to the faces that had never left him. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" Another pause. "I can't discuss details over the phone." "When?" "Soon." The line disconnected. Ethan remained standing in the quiet kitchen long after the call had ended. Outside, autumn wind rustled the American flag hanging from his porch. Inside, the old photograph lay open beneath the kitchen light. For years, Ethan had believed the past was something he had to survive. Now it was becoming something that had finally begun asking to be heard. Ethan barely slept. The phone call from Washington echoed through the quiet house long after midnight. He sat at the kitchen table beneath a single yellow light, the old platoon photograph spread beside an untouched cup of coffee. Outside, Wyoming wind rattled the loose gutter along the roof, a familiar sound that usually helped him feel grounded. Tonight, it only reminded him how easily old foundations could shake. He turned the photograph over once more. The truth is finally coming. Someone had known. Someone had waited all these years. The next morning, Liberty Oaks felt unusually quiet. Word had spread that Crosswell Development intended to accelerate its proposal. Several residents stood in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that carried more uncertainty than anger. Walter Jennings watched Ethan approach. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan managed a tired smile. "Maybe the ghost finally found me." Walter chuckled softly before his expression grew serious. "You leaving?" "I don't know." "You'd better come back."
"I plan to," Walter nodded.
"We're all counting on that." Linda Chavez walked briskly across the courtyard carrying a folder. "Someone's here asking for you." Ethan followed her toward the office. A black government sedan waited outside. Not flashy, not intimidating, just official. A man in his early 50s stepped out wearing a dark blue suit with military precision still evident in the way he stood. "Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker?" "Yes." The man extended his hand. "Colonel David Mercer, thank you for agreeing to meet." Ethan shook it. "You didn't exactly leave me much choice." A faint smile crossed Mercer's face. "No, I suppose not." He glanced around the aging buildings. "You've built quite a life here." "I've tried." Mercer studied Ethan for a long moment. "You'll need to come to Washington." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Ethan frowned. "Why now?" "Because several classified operational files have finally been cleared for release." He lowered his voice. And because someone has spent the last 12 years fighting to make sure your story wasn't buried forever.
Ethan's heartbeat quickened. My story? Our story, Mercer corrected. There's more than one man who has been carrying this. Before Ethan could ask another question, Mercer handed him a sealed folder. Inside were airline tickets, travel orders, and a short letter from the Department of Defense. At the bottom appeared a sentence that made Ethan stop breathing for a moment. Attendance requested regarding the formal review of Operation Iron Resolve. He hadn't heard that operation's official name in over a decade. He closed the folder slowly. I thought that file was sealed forever. So did most of us. Mercer looked toward the mountains. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. That evening, Sarah Collins arrived at Liberty Oaks carrying a small recorder she never switched on. I heard you're leaving. For a few days. Washington? Ethan looked surprised. News travels fast. I have sources. She hesitated. Can I ask one thing? You usually do. Are they finally going to clear your name? Ethan looked away. I honestly don't know what they're going to do. What if they don't? He considered the question. Then tomorrow will look a lot like yesterday. Sarah watched him carefully. You really believe that? I stopped expecting justice a long time ago. She nodded slowly. Maybe justice hasn't stopped looking for you. The following morning, frost still covered the runway when the small government aircraft lifted into the pale Wyoming sky. Ethan sat beside Colonel Mercer in silence. Snow-covered mountains disappeared beneath the clouds. Hours later, Washington spread beneath them. Row of monuments, government buildings, history carved into stone. It had been years since Ethan had worn anything resembling a suit. The borrowed Navy jacket felt unfamiliar against his shoulders. Mercer noticed. You look uncomfortable. I'd rather be fixing heaters. Mercer smiled. I've heard.
A black SUV carried them through the city toward the Pentagon Annex, where security officers escorted them through several checkpoints. The deeper they walked into the building, the quieter everything became. Finally, they entered a conference room unlike any Ethan had expected. There were no cameras, no reporters, only a long table surrounded by military officers, investigators, legal advisors, and several civilians. One familiar face immediately caught his attention. Judge Harold Whitmore. The elderly judge stood and walked toward him. We finally meet properly. Ethan blinked. You're the grandfather. He smiled warmly. My grandson still talks about the man who pulled him off that highway. Ethan remembered instantly. The diner. Yes. You never told me who you were. I wanted to know who you were first. Another woman stood nearby. Sarah Collins. She looked equally surprised. They invited you too? Ethan asked. She nodded. I've spent 6 months investigating your military records. You have? They weren't nearly as sealed as someone wanted people to believe. Across the room, another man slowly rose from his chair. His left arm ended below the elbow. A silver star rested quietly on the lapel of his jacket. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Then the newcomer smiled. Still standing, Walker? Ethan's eyes widened. Tom? Major Thomas Reed laughed. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me. Ethan crossed the room and embraced him without hesitation. I know what you thought. I was told everyone, not everyone. They stepped back. Emotion filled Ethan's face. You survived. Barely. Tom's smile faded. You saved me. The room grew silent. Several investigators exchanged glances. One activated a digital recorder. Colonel Mercer addressed the room.
For the record, today's proceedings concern the declassification review of Operation Iron Resolve conducted in eastern Afghanistan 12 years ago. He looked toward Ethan.
Staff Sergeant Walker, before today, the official record stated that your decision to disregard evacuation orders compromised a classified operation. Ethan nodded quietly. Yes. Mercer continued. The newly declassified intelligence paints a different picture. Screens illuminated around the room, satellite images, mission maps, previously blacked out documents, radio transcripts. One by one, pieces of a forgotten history emerged. An intelligence officer pointed toward the largest screen. The operation's true objective was the protection of an undercover intelligence network operating inside the region. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. How many assets were involved? 37. And disclosure at the time? Would likely have resulted in their deaths. Another investigator spoke. Staff Sergeant Walker disobeyed an evacuation order. Ethan lowered his eyes. I did. Why? The room waited. He answered exactly as he remembered. Because my men were still alive. Silence. Tom Reed spoke next. He isn't telling you everything. Every head turned toward him. The convoy was hit harder than command realized. Images changed again. Destroyed vehicles. Smoke. Impact reports. Tom continued. I was trapped beneath an overturned armored vehicle. His voice trembled slightly. They ordered Ethan to pull back. He looked directly at the panel. He ignored them. He came back. He carried 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire. He came back again. And then again. Tom paused. I told him to leave me. Ethan stared silently at the table. He refused. The major took a slow breath. If Ethan had obeyed orders... He looked around the room. I wouldn't be sitting here today. Neither would 6 others. A military attorney stood. Why wasn't this included in the original report? No one answered immediately. Finally, Lieutenant General Robert Ashcroft, now retired, slowly rose from his chair. His hair was completely white. His medals reflected softly beneath the conference room lights. I'll answer that. The room fell completely silent. Ashcroft looked directly at Ethan. I owe you that much. His voice remained steady despite the weight behind every word. At the time, revealing Staff Sergeant Walker's actions would have exposed the existence of our intelligence network. He swallowed carefully. Dozens of undercover personnel were still operating inside Afghanistan. The decision was made. He paused. To classify everything. Judge Whitmore asked quietly, even if that meant destroying one soldier's reputation? Ashcroft closed his eyes briefly. Yes. The single word settled over the room like heavy snowfall. I signed that decision. No one spoke. I believed I was protecting 37 lives. He looked toward Ethan. I never imagined the cost to yours. Sarah Collins slowly lowered her pen. She had spent months chasing fragments of truth. Now she was watching history rewrite itself. Colonel Mercer placed another folder before the review board. Additional witness statements have also been recovered. Among them was one final document, an audio transcript recorded only hours after the battle. The final debrief of Captain Michael Harris, the platoon leader, who never returned home. Mercer read aloud. If Walker survives. He stopped briefly. Tell command he saved every man he could. Another line followed. He'll blame himself. Don't let history blame him too. No one in the room moved. Ethan stared at the table, unable to speak. For 12 years he had carried guilt that was never his alone. For 12 years he had believed silence meant acceptance.
Now every forgotten voice seemed to be speaking at once. Judge Whitmore quietly removed his glasses. I've presided over federal courts for nearly 3 decades. His voice carried across the room. I've rarely seen a greater injustice. The review board recessed briefly. As Ethan stepped into the hallway, he stopped beside a window overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. Autumn leaves drifted across the grass below. Tom joined him. You okay? Ethan laughed softly through tired eyes. I don't know.
Tom looked toward the sky. They're finally telling the truth. Ethan nodded. I just wish Mason could hear it. So do I. A military aide approached them. Staff Sergeant Walker? Yes? The review board has reached its preliminary findings. He smiled gently. They'd like you back inside. Ethan straightened his borrowed jacket. For years he had walked into rooms expecting judgment. This time, he walked towards something he had almost forgotten still existed. Hope. When Ethan stepped back into the conference room, no one spoke at first. The silence carried a different weight now. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence that follows the truth. Colonel David Mercer remained standing beside the long oak table, a leather folder resting beneath his hand. Around him sat military investigators, legal advisors, retired commanders, Judge Harold Whitmore, Sarah Collins, and Major Thomas Reed. Every face reflected the same realization. For 12 years, one man had carried a burden that had never truly belonged to him. Mercer broke the silence. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker, after reviewing the newly declassified operational records, sworn testimony, battlefield communications, and witness statements, this board has reached a unanimous conclusion. He paused only long enough for every word to settle. The official findings against you are hereby vacated. Ethan lowered his eyes. His shoulders did not lift. He did not smile. Instead, he simply closed them for a moment. It felt strangely unfamiliar to stop carrying something that had become part of him. General Robert Ashcroft slowly rose from his chair. Age had bent his posture, but not his voice. I owe you more than an apology. He stepped toward Ethan. 12 years ago, I signed an order that protected a classified intelligence network. His voice faltered. In doing so, I allowed your name to carry responsibility that should never have rested on your shoulders. The room remained still. I believed I was protecting 37 intelligence assets operating inside Afghanistan. He looked Ethan directly in the eyes. But I failed to protect one soldier standing right in front of me. No one interrupted. I cannot undo those years. I cannot return the opportunities you lost. I cannot erase the nights you've spent believing you failed your brothers. His voice softened. But today, I can finally tell the truth. Ashcroft extended his hand. I am sorry. Ethan looked at the aging general for several long seconds before accepting the handshake. I know why you made the decision. Ashcroft blinked. I've spent enough years in uniform to understand impossible choices. He released the general's hand. I just wish someone had told me someday would come. Mercer nodded quietly. It has. The hearing concluded just before sunset. Outside the Pentagon, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalks as Sarah Collins caught up with Ethan. I've covered politics for 12 years, she smiled faintly. I've never seen a room go that quiet. Ethan looked toward the fading sky. I didn't come here to make history. I know. You'll write about it? I'll write all of it. She held up the old photograph. The public deserves every page. So do the men in that picture. A week later, her article appeared nationwide, not with a sensational headline, not with dramatic speculation. Instead, the front page simply read, The Soldier Who Never Stopped Serving. The story spread farther than anyone expected. Television stations picked it up. Veteran organizations shared it. Military families passed it from one generation to the next. People recognized not only what Ethan had done in Afghanistan, but what he had continued doing every ordinary day afterward. Repairing wheelchairs, fixing heaters, helping homeless veterans, saving a frightened child, serving without expecting anyone to notice. Back in Cody, Wyoming, Liberty Oaks was unusually busy. News vans lined the street, neighbors gathered outside.
Walter Jennings sat in his wheelchair watching the activity with quiet amusement.
"Took them long enough,"
Linda Chavez laughed.
"What?
"Figuring out what we've known for years?"
She looked toward Ethan, who was replacing a broken porch light as though nothing had changed. "That man never stopped being a soldier." The story produced consequences no one had anticipated. Investigators examining Crosswell development uncovered fraudulent property valuations and illegal agreements designed to force veterans from Liberty Oaks far below market value. Within weeks, state investigators opened a formal inquiry. Construction permits were suspended. The proposed redevelopment collapsed. Federal housing grants were approved instead. The aging buildings would be renovated rather than demolished. New wheelchair ramps, modern heating systems, access apartments. The place Ethan had quietly cared for would finally receive the investment it deserved. Walter rolled beside him one afternoon as workers unloaded supplies.
"Looks like you're finally getting new pipes."
Ethan smiled. "They needed them." Walter nudged him gently. "So did you." Several months later, another envelope arrived. This one bore an official seal. Inside was an invitation. Arlington National Cemetery, National Veterans Recognition Ceremony. Attendance requested. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cool. Rolls of white marble headstones stretched across the rolling green hills beneath a brilliant blue sky. American flags fluttered softly in the breeze. Families stood quietly together. Veterans adjusted old uniforms. The distant notes of America the Beautiful drifted across the grounds from the military band. Ethan walked slowly through the cemetery, wearing a dark blue suit. Pinned inside the jacket pocket rested the old platoon photograph. He wanted them with him. Every one of them. Major Thomas Reed walked beside him. "You ready?" Ethan looked across the endless rows of markers. "I don't know." "You don't have to be." The ceremony began with the mournful sound of taps. The familiar notes floated gently through the morning air, carrying memories too deep for words. Many veterans quietly wiped away tears. Judge Harold Whitmore sat among invited guests. Sarah Collins stood near the press section, notebook closed. Today, she wasn't there to write. She was there to witness. Colonel Mercer stepped to the podium. "For extraordinary courage in combat, for unwavering devotion to fellow soldiers, for continued service to veterans and community after military duty, it is my honor to announce that Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." Applause slowly spread across the cemetery. Not loud, respectful, earned. As Ethan approached the platform, General Ashcroft personally placed the medal around his neck. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. When invited to address the gathering, Ethan stood quietly before the microphone. Hundreds waited. Television cameras watched. He looked down briefly before speaking. "I've spent a long time wondering why I came home when so many better men didn't." His voice remained calm. "I don't have an answer." He looked toward the rows of headstones. "But I know this. The men I served beside taught me something that never left. When someone needs help, you help. You don't ask whether they'll thank you. You don't ask who they voted for. You don't ask where they came from. You simply help." He paused. "Everything good that's happened to me
started because somebody needed help. Silence filled the cemetery. Then applause returned, stronger this time. After the ceremony, a woman approached slowly, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Ethan recognized her immediately. The woman from the cemetery, the one who had watched him weeks earlier. She stopped only a few feet away. "My name is Emily Harris." She held out the lilies. "I was married to Captain Michael Harris." Ethan's breath caught. Michael, his platoon leader, his closest friend. "I've wanted to meet you for years," she said quietly. "You sent the photograph?" She nodded. "Michael wrote me one last letter before the mission." She reached into her purse and removed a carefully folded envelope worn by time. "I've carried this for 12 years. With trembling hands, she unfolded the final page. "The last paragraph wasn't about me." She smiled through tears. "It was about you." She handed him the letter. In familiar handwriting were the words he had carried unknowingly all this time. "If I don't make it home, tell Ethan he did everything right. Tell him he saved us all. Don't let him spend his life believing otherwise." Ethan read the lines twice, then a third time. For years he had replayed that mission every night, every decision, every loss, every impossible choice. Now, for the first time, another voice spoke louder than his guilt. Michael's. Emily gently squeezed his arm. "He never blamed you. He loved you like a brother, and he would be proud of the life you've lived." Ethan looked across Arlington. The wind stirred the flags. Somewhere nearby, children laughed softly as they followed their grandparents between the rows of white stones. Healing, he realized, wasn't forgetting. It was finally allowing the truth to stand beside the pain. Months later, Memorial Day arrived in Cody. Main Street looked different. American flags lined every storefront. Veterans marched together. School children held handmade signs thanking those who served. Outside Liberty Oaks, Walter Jennings saluted as Ethan walked past. "So," Walter grinned, "how does it feel to be famous?" Ethan laughed. "I was hoping nobody would notice." Too late. The crowd welcomed him with warm applause. Not because he had become someone new, because they had finally learned who he had always been. Ethan never left Liberty Oaks. He accepted an advisory role helping veterans living with PTSD across Wyoming. But every morning he still repaired broken railings, fixed leaking faucets, and shared coffee with the residents who had become family. The metal remained locked safely inside a small wooden box. The old photograph stayed on his kitchen table. One reminded him what he had done. The other reminded him who he had done it for. As evening settled over Cody, Ethan stopped beside the flagpole outside Liberty Oaks. The American flag caught the last golden light of sunset. Walter rolled up beside him. "You know what I think?" "What?" "The medal didn't change you." Ethan smiled. "It wasn't supposed to." Walter nodded toward the residents laughing together on the porch. "It changed everybody else." Ethan looked around quietly. At the veterans who no longer feared being forgotten. At neighbors who now greeted them by name. At a town that had finally remembered the people who had once stood watch for it. He smiled gently. Some heroes return from war carrying medals. Others return carrying invisible wounds. But the greatest among them never stop serving, even when no one is watching. Edit. And sometimes, after years of silence, the truth finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and honor those who served. Ethan Walker didn't become a hero the day he received the Distinguished Service Cross. He proved who he was every time he chose to help someone, even when the world had forgotten his name and questioned his character. His journey reminds us that honor is protected by the choices we make, not by the recognition we receive. Justice may arrive years late, but when the truth finally stands in the light, it gives dignity back not only to one veteran, but to everyone who never stopped believing in what was right. Today, take a moment to thank someone whose quiet service often goes unnoticed, or simply offer kindness without expecting anything in return. Like Ethan Walker, you may never know how one selfless act can restore hope in another person's life. Did Ethan Walker's story change the way you see the silent heroes living among us? Tell us in the comments which moment best reflected his true honor. And if this story stayed with you, join us again for another journey honoring the courage, sacrifice, and humanity of those who served.